Way before we get started, I don't know if you all know, but Sister Ann is in Pikeville Medical Center with the last we heard she has some blood clots in her lungs. I don't know what her status is today, but she is better. That's good, but we'll need to keep her in our prayers. Okay. Some people are intimidated by the title of leader. Others are eager to take charge. You've probably been around some people that are like that. Some just naturally have the tendency to jump in and get the job done. Some are not so eager to do that. I'm reminded of one of the disciples that had that tendency. Do y'all have any idea who I might be talking about? Peter. He was always ready to jump in there and do what he felt was the best thing to do, but he was still in the learning process, and he didn't always do the right thing. He had a lot of learning to do, but he was eager to take charge. So how does that title fit you? How does it make you feel? We use the label intentional leader interchangeably with disciple maker. And the reason is we don't see Jesus leading by accident. Everything that he done, he had a purpose. Now, the disciples, needless to say, in their learning stages, did not always, matter of fact, hardly ever, knew what his game plan was. But Jesus knew. But we certainly know that he was not haphazard in his approach. So as a disciple maker, he intentionally led his followers. And we'll be looking at several stories today to picture exactly what happened. Now, many willing Christians have absolutely no plan for disciple making. Some even spiritualize their lack of intention as if it leaves more room for God to be at work. Others follow a curriculum but have no idea how to make disciples. But Jesus had a plan but was not limited by a curriculum. So let's look closer at his intentional leadership. Would someone like to, and it's a little bit lengthy, but would someone like to read, let's turn to John chapter 6, and I'll give you a few minutes to get there. If you have your books, the story is on the right-hand margin. I don't know about y'all, but that's kind of small print for me. John chapter 6, beginning with verse 2 through verse 14. And this is a very familiar story where Jesus feeds a large multitude. Okay. Several interesting things that I see in this lesson, and there's some other things that are pointed out that really I don't fully understand, and I'll be first to admit that. I don't know why he just numbered how many men were present. Obviously, there were women and children in the crowd. We just don't know how many. And I don't know that that's important. The important thing is the circumstances. This crowd had assembled to hear Jesus teach. And it was getting time for them to eat. They were hungry. And there was some concern among the disciples as to how they would feed them. So Jesus asked Philip a question. And he already knew the answer that he would hear. He knew what his plan was. And it says that he'd done this to test Philip. So if you and if you look there in verse 5, he says, and I'm reading from the New King James. I'm not sure what translation this is in the margin. It says, Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, Where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now, what do you think Jesus meant by this? Right.
What follows that, okay, as far as if that was what really meant and wanted to do.
Right. Yeah, I had read somewhere else another translation that said this was that his response was that it would take approximately 8 months' wages, and that was just to give everyone a little bit to eat. So obviously it was going to take a significant amount of food to feed this crowd. Okay, so now Jesus knew what he intended to teach before, as I said, before he asked Philip the question. So item 3 here says to name one lesson that the people, the boy, or the disciples learned from Jesus that day. So what are some lessons that we see that were taught by Jesus in this particular situation? That he would provide. Not only did he provide, but he took a very small amount of food. Remember, he picked out a boy in the crowd that had, let's see. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. And notice he emphasizes that these were small loaves and small fish. We had 5,000 plus people here. So if you just think about it logically, that's not enough to go around. That's not even enough to get started. But what we see here is one lesson is Jesus could take a little and make a lot out of it. So that's one lesson. What's another that we see? What did the boy learn? Well, that was the lesson the boy learned, that he could take a little bit and turn it into a lot. What did the crowd learn from this? What was their remark right at the end of this in verse 14?
Some came to hear him. Some probably came because they were curious.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a lot of reasons why there'd be a crowd that large there to see the word of mouth travel. But,
Right.
they learned that he was a prophet.
Yeah.
He said.
Right. That he was the prophet that had come into the world. What do you think the lesson was for his disciples that they might have learned from witnessing this miracle?
The Lord will bless what you bring to him.
Yes. I think also they learned that he truly was the Son of God. In order to do something this dramatic and this fantastic, he had to be. He truly was the prophet that came to save the world.
Got one other take on this.
Sure.
You know, Jesus took what was there, okay, and he added to it. You said earlier, he did that with the wine also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he could have done that, okay, without there being any fish there, but he seemed to always take, okay, what was on hand.
Right.
And then show the people, okay, and I don't know, maybe he made them a part of it always, okay, and that's what he wanted to do to include.
That's true.
I always find that interesting.
Yeah. That's true. He could have made something out of nothing, but he chose to just take what was available. I think that's a lesson to us too, is that we sometimes may feel like we don't have the resources that we need to do what God would have us to do. But if we put our faith to practice, we can take what God has given us, no matter how little we may think that it is, and he can take that and bless our efforts and turn it into something that's very beneficial. Good point. Anyone else have any comments regarding the feeding of the 5,000 before we move on? We've got several stories here to go through. Okay. Someone be turning to Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 10. Again, another very story that should come to mind regarding little short man. Not to offend anyone that might not be so tall, but that's one of the characteristics about Zacchaeus that a lot of people remember. Would someone like to read from Luke 19, verses 1 through 10? Okay. Item 4 in your book. It says, read the story of Zacchaeus. And it poses the question, what are two things Jesus did intentionally to make a disciple out of Zacchaeus? Now, while we're thinking about our response to that, and I wrote down a couple of things that I observed, and then, but I'd like you to note some things that are mentioned in this story that I think have some significance. One, Zacchaeus' occupation. He was a tax collector. Now, if you know anything about the Jewish society, you'll remember that tax collectors were not the most favorite members of their society. Now, why was that? Why were they not well liked? Have any idea? Any thoughts? Most of them were corrupt. They were in an opportunity to where they could become very wealthy. And it mentions that he was not only a tax collector, it says he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. I think that's kind of interesting. But aside from his occupation and the fact that he was wealthy, and with that in mind, again, let's think about this question. What are two things Jesus did intentionally to make a disciple out of Zacchaeus? What was something that Zacchaeus done that showed us a little bit about his inner self or his intentions? Yeah. He was eager to see Jesus. He was so eager, and because of the fact that he was not of tall stature, that he climbed a tree to get high up to where he could see Jesus. Right. Okay. So, getting back to our question, what's one thing that Jesus did intentionally to make a disciple out of Zacchaeus? That was one. Yep. He looked up into the tree and saw Zacchaeus and singled him out of the crowd. He was the one person in the crowd that Jesus paid attention to in particular and spoke to him. Actually, he called him to come down and then told him, he invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. So those were the two things that Jesus done intentionally. So I'm sure that played a big part in Zacchaeus' frame of mind. I know it would have me. But he intentionally picked him out of the crowd, and he invited himself into his home. Now, this caused a big stir amongst the rest of the crowd, and they started mumbling and grumbling about the fact that Jesus was going to be with a sinner, because he was a tax collector. He was considered a not so good member of society. But Jesus purposefully announced that salvation had come to Zacchaeus' house, and that he had come to seek and save lost people. Now, just something else I noticed here. It said there towards the end, I think in verse 9, it says that today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. What do y'all think is meant by that phrase, a son of Abraham? Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yep. Right. Exactly. He was a Jew, but he had a job to do in that. And like you said, this was a Roman province. Someone had to be the bad guy, so to speak, and collect taxes for the Romans. So he was not well liked for that reason, but Jesus made it clear that regardless of that, he was still a Jew and was worthy of salvation. Which I guess we've sort of kind of jumped ahead and answered the question posed in verse 5. it says, there is yet another layer of intentional disciple making in this story. What was Jesus teaching the disciples who were already following him? That's true. And the fact that, which was a very obvious part of this lesson, is that Jesus loved everyone. He didn't come to just single out certain individuals or a certain race of people. He came to save all that were lost. Now, among other things, the disciples clearly heard Jesus express his mission, and they were witnesses to how he dealt with grumblers who criticized him. The classroom was Zacchaeus' house, and the lesson included Jesus' love for the lost. Now, these lessons were not accidents. Jesus did not begin the day saying, "Well, boys, I wonder what we'll learn today." He did not seat them in a circle and throw out the comment, "Does anybody have anything to share?" Jesus knew what his disciples needed to learn. He intentionally cooperated with his Father, which was an important lesson for the disciples to learn. Now, what was Zacchaeus doing that caused Jesus to spot him or to single him out of the crowd? Pardon? He climbed a tree. I mean, that would catch my attention. You know, if I were walking down the street and I saw some guy running up ahead of the crowd and climbing a tree, you know, to get a better view, that would catch my attention. Yeah, that is true. Okay. But it really shows his attitude. He really wanted, I think, he really wanted very much to see Jesus. So, number 7, how did Zacchaeus' climbing to the top of a tree help Jesus see what his father, to see that his father was already at work in the tax collector's life? Now think about that before you answer that question. How did Zacchaeus climbing to the top of a tree help Jesus to see that his father was already at work in Zacchaeus' life? Right? That's true. That's true. Right. Right. That's true. I see something else too here that kind of shows me that of Zacchaeus' personal feelings towards viewing himself and his occupation, his abilities, and what he may or may not have been doing. But it mentions here when he invited himself to go to Zacchaeus' house, he said, "Because today I will be with you in your house." And Zacchaeus' reply was, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." I think this was sort of shows that he was possibly somewhat penitent about his his occupation and the fact that he did have so much money and he wasn't doing anything with it. But he vowed to give half of what he had that very day to the poor. So I think that shows the Holy Spirit was working on this man. Anyone else have any thoughts? Uh-huh. Right. Mm-hmm. That yeah, that's true. That is true. But he was willing not only to pay back anything he had cheated them out of, but 4 times that amount. So that says a lot about his intentions. So Zacchaeus climbed the tree because he was eager to see Jesus. God was already drawing him to the kingdom, and that day the disciples watched Jesus join his Father's work to reach an already searching Zacchaeus. Okay, we've got any other questions or remarks about Zacchaeus that anyone might want to? Yes, sir.
I find it interesting that out of that whole crowd and the way the crowd reacted, okay, to what Jesus said to Zacchaeus, of course, they reacted negatively. They looked and said, well, he's going to the home of a sinner.
Right.
And I think that parallels what we see, okay, in the church today, because people are saved one individual at a time.
Right.
It doesn't seem the crowd ever, okay, joins in collectively, but it's a one at a time kind of thing. We see that with discipleship.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Now, being an intentional leader does not mean controlling every possible distraction so that we can execute the perfect lesson plan. We're going to see from a couple of other stories that we're going to read here about how Jesus was flexible and he met people on their level without sacrificing his intention to make disciples. Because everyone's different. People grow at different rates. An intentional leader adjusts his or her approach but continues to deliberately work towards making people disciples. Okay, so I'm going to read from John chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 and verses 7 and 8 regarding the story where Mary anoints Jesus' feet. And I'll give you all time to get there. John chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now, 1 through 3, and then we'll skip to 7 and 8. Then, I'll be reading from the New King James Version. Then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus had been, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Now let's skip down to verse 7. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." Now, I'm going to show you here how Jesus adjusted his plan in each one of these stories. This first one being when Mary anoints Jesus' feet. And they range from spiritually dead to infant, to child, to young adult, to parent. So you can see a progressive stage of growth here. So, what do you think Mary's stage of spiritual growth was that Jesus was addressing here in this story? Pardon? Young adult. And he not only defended Mary's actions because she had broken this bottle and had used this very expensive oil, which one of the other disciples got onto her for doing so, and made a remark about what could have been done with the money that could have been obtained from that. But he knew what was in Mary's heart, and he used this example to encourage her faith. Okay, let's move on now to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, verses 20 through 24. Would someone like to read those verses, please? Okay, so here we have a story of Jesus healing this possessed boy. The father cried out here in verse 24, "Help my unbelief." This clearly shows that this father was desperate. It shows a condition of his heart. He was confused about Christ. His behavior was similar to how someone who is spiritually speaking, an infant or a child, in his stage of spiritual growth. So Jesus adjusted his approach to help the man grow as a disciple. Jesus did not declare, "Since you are a spiritual infant, I will heal your son," but he led the discussion to meet the man where he was in his stage of spiritual growth. Okay, and finally, let's look at the last story in John chapter 21. John chapter 21, where Peter and Jesus are by the sea, beginning in verse 15. 15 through 17. Would someone like to read those two verses, please?
When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep."
This is kind of interesting for a number of reasons to me. One, I think it's worthy of mentioning the fact that Jesus asked Peter 3 times if he loved him. I think there's some significance in that. When you think back about the fact that Peter had denied, or that he would deny Christ 3 times. But the important thing here is that Jesus spoke to him as a spiritual young adult who was growing and becoming a spiritual parent. So Jesus challenged Peter to take care and provide for his followers, or what he referred to as sheep. And he directed him to join him in ministry and even hinted at Peter continuing with Jesus. So we can see in all 3 of these cases that Jesus adjusted his leadership to the person's needs and depending on at what stage that individual was in their spiritual growth. So being intentional in our leadership does not mean that we have to be very rigid and that we're not willing to adjust or change, because that's exactly what we have to do. We have to be able to look at the situation and, again, not do anything haphazardly or by accident, but to continue to drive the discipleship process. So, let's look at our 3 points for review. The discipleship journey requires an intentional leader, someone that does what they do, not by accident or not haphazardly, but with the sole intention of bringing this person to Jesus and teaching them to follow him in every way. Jesus, we can see in all of these stories that we've read this morning, modeled being intentional. Nothing was done by accident. And he continuously adapted his plan based on the individual that he was working with and looking at their needs and seeing what their stage of spiritual growth was in their development. Any other questions or comments before we wrap our lesson up today? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your attention, and we'll see you again next week.